let's talk about some recent reads. I've been doing a lot of wrap-ups for what I've read last year, but I haven't had a ton of time to talk about what I've been reading this year so far. An audiobook I listened to recently was The Cipher by Kath Koha. This was a horror novel about a guy and a girl who are friends with benefits who find this thing that they call the fun hole. Essentially, it is a hole in a supply closet in his apartment building that has some otherworldly type of dimension inside it. Basically, they start to experiment with it and discover that when they put things inside of it, they come back a little altered. I tried reading this on ebook first, and it's very stream of consciousness. It's just like huge paragraphs, like of just non-stop blabbering almost, and I could not get into it. I was enjoying what I was reading, but I just found it so mentally draining that I couldn't really keep up. And so I decided to start listening to it on audiobook, and this was the way to go. I loved it. This was such an ugly story. It honestly gave me similar vibes to the movie Requiem for a Dream, if you've ever seen that. This was the same story, it just had that same disgusting atmosphere. I do think that it loses steam a little bit towards the end. It gets very weird, but definitely kind of goes on a little bit too long in sort of an aimless direction. But I really thought it was unique experience to most of the things I've read. It seemed to have a lot to say about religion, I think. It's hard to tell, but I believe that's what it was saying a lot about it, because it really started to idolize this fun hole and what it can do. And in the end, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I also listened to all 3 books in the Grishaverse Shadow and Bone series by Leigh Bardugo. Obviously, I listened to these in anticipation of the Netflix show. I've never read these books, but I have read Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, and I absolutely love them. But the thing that works for me about those books is that they revolve around a heist. Yes, it takes place in a fantasy realm, but I feel like if you're not a fantasy lover, you can still read the Six of Crows duology and be okay. Whereas with these books, the Shadow and Bone trilogy, it is very clearly fantasy books, which I'm just not as interested in. But I listened to them on audiobook, and it was an enjoyable enough experience. I do feel like this is kind of younger, because the characters act in somewhat immature ways. Like, the main character spends a lot of time thinking about boys. She has these huge problems on her hands, and she has this huge war brewing, and yet she's still just like thinking about who kissed her last or who she talked to last. And I will say, I don't understand the Darkling love. I just found him so uninteresting, and not because he was this grotesque monster. I just, like, he didn't say or do anything that interesting. So, didn't get that, but I did love Mal, which everyone seems to hate, but loved him. Enjoyed their dynamic, more so before they got together than when they actually did get together, but I don't know. Like, fantasy books, it turns out, still do nothing for me. I gave these like 3.5 out of 5 stars. Like, I truly got nothing to say about them. I felt much the same way when I read these as I did when I read The Poppy War or when I read Nevernight. It just, like, fantasy just isn't for me. A book I read on ebook was The Push by Ashley Audrain, and I loved this. This is a thriller about a woman who gives birth to a daughter, and she just doesn't feel right about it. Something seems a little off with her daughter, and she can't tell if it has to do with her or if it's the girl. I thought this book was so interesting, and I think it did things in such an interesting way that really took a look at mother and daughter relationships in general, the kind of trauma that gets passed down from generation to generation. I think it also took a look a lot at postpartum depression, which, I mean, so many women suffer from postpartum depression, but yet it still isn't that talked about, which is crazy to me. And I loved that there was this aspect of, okay, maybe it is the mother and she just hasn't been the best mother to this girl, and maybe she is just suffering from postpartum depression. But there was also the aspect that maybe it is this girl, and I feel like the author did such a good job of walking that fine line of giving you clues to both possibilities. And it was just so good. It definitely made me feel like, okay, motherhood is terrifying. Like, there were so many horrific details, physically and emotionally, involving motherhood, that I was like, I'm so glad I've never been so solid in my decision not to have children than after I read this book. I feel like you really can look at this book as just like this fun, horror, twisty thriller, or you can look at it as a character study about motherhood and this woman's relationship with her daughter. It was just so well done. I can't wait to read what this author puts out in the future. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. Another audiobook I listened to was Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah is a late-time talk show host, and this story is about his childhood in South Africa. Much in the same way that In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park taught me a lot about Korea, this taught me a lot about Africa. Like, I don't know anything about South Africa. And I feel like getting to hear so much about his childhood really gives you a sense of the country. I will say that Yeonmi Park's book is more about her country than it is about her specific upbringing. I mean, it also is about that too, but she talks a lot about the state of affairs in the country and why her childhood was the way it was. And Trevor Noah definitely talks about that, about South Africa in his book as well, but I feel like it's more about his specific anecdotal experiences, and especially about his relationship with his mother, which was just so lovely. And it was a lot nicer and more pleasant of a story than I was expecting it to be, because I've heard a lot of people talk about like how heartbreaking the story is at times, and I mean, it definitely is. But I feel like the amount of strength and humor he was able to get in his situation, as well as from his mother, was just incredible. It was a really, really enjoyable experience. I love listening to Trevor Noah narrate the book. It was so cool, or it was so fun, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. He truly did just have such a crazy, interesting life growing up. And I mean, this book didn't even talk about his rise to fame. This was all just like from the time he was born to like the time he was 25, which it's crazy that you can have that interesting of a life in that period of time and then still become a celebrity. And that's not even the most interesting part of who you are. I feel like I didn't even go into why it's called Born a Crime, but essentially his father was white and his mother was black, and it was illegal in his country to have children that were mixed race, and so he had to hide a lot of the time, and he literally wasn't allowed to go outside at times because it was illegal and they were afraid that he would be taken away from his family. And yeah, it goes a lot into identity surrounding race because of like just how complicated aspects of racial relations were in his country and continue to be. I also listened to The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. I don't have a ton to say about this though, because I don't know, for some reason it just didn't stick with me as much. It was about her upbringing as a child and just kind of the interesting childhood she led with parents who were very much nomadic. They didn't really want to live a normal lifestyle, and so they kind of just picked up their kids and went whenever they felt like it. And they were more on this quest for adventure than they were for a good life. And because of that, it put the kids in a lot of unfortunate situations. It led to them having to scrounge for food and clothes most of the time. They were very, very poor for most of their life. And it had a very like positive tone to it because she clearly did love her parents very much, and they mostly seemed to love her back. It was a very complicated relationship and showed a lot about how different families can be. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars though, because for whatever reason, like, I don't think it's going to stick with me. But maybe that's just because I've been listening to so many amazing nonfiction lately that I just feel like some of them are bound to not be as memorable than others. Another book I finished was The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I'm sure most of you know what this is about, and I absolutely love this. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I totally was not expecting that. I actually started reading this back in 2018. I got like 100 pages in, and then I just put it down, never came back to it. Sometimes when I DNF books, it's not because I'm not enjoying them, it's more just because like I'm a mood reader and I kind of flip wherever I feel like it. But I finally decided to pick this back up and start over again completely, and I just ended up absolutely adoring it. I think Margaret Atwood is such a good writer. I mean, that's so obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me because I'd never read anything from her. I thought this was going to be so hard to read because whenever there's any sort of classic writer, I just assume I'm not going to understand it and that it's going to go over my head or something, or that's going to be really dense or complicated, and I don't feel like her writing is. Like, I feel like it does a very good job of being sort of flowery, just a little bit told very lyrically almost, but not so much so that like it's so metaphorical that you don't understand what's going on. I feel like she gives you just the right details to let you feel things emotionally. Like, she picks out the details that will hit you the most without going into so much details that she's exploiting female pain. Because I feel like that happens a lot in any sort of dystopian feminist novel. But she does just like such a great job of not being gratuitous with her violence. I will say the one thing I wish is that it explored more of the world outside of this community. I'm hoping that maybe the show does that because like I want to know how other parts of the world are dealing with this crisis as well. I started watching the show, I'm only 4 episodes in, but I'm really liking it so far. I will say the changes from the book to the show are very interesting because I feel like they almost go against everything that Margaret Atwood was writing, but that's a whole topic for another time. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I'm going to talk about here is The Children of Red Peak by Craig DeLuey. So this was a thriller or horror, I'm not totally sure, about a group of kids who survived a doomsday cult. This is fiction, by the way. I feel like I've been talking about so much nonfiction, I should specify that. Essentially, there was a couple kids who survived this church where all their parents went and killed themselves, as well as killed some of their kids who didn't want to go with them. And it's now 15 years later, and they're kind of looking back at what happened and trying to figure it out because the bodies disappeared after they committed suicide, and nobody knows what happened. I really enjoyed this, though I definitely do think it had its flaws. There were like 5 main kids in the survivors, and they really only went through 3 of the kids' perspectives, and that was a little bit weird because the other 2 felt just as important, yet we never really saw them that much. We never really got their characters. We never gave them any sort of time. And so one of the catalytic events of this novel is that one of the characters commits suicide, and that's what brings all these people back together. And I felt like her character was so thin, the character who had committed suicide. Like, I had no reason to care about this character, and I feel like that's something that a lot of shows and TV shows and books and stuff struggle to do with a character who's dead. I feel like you really have to make the audience care. I feel like the rest of the characters were decently sketched out. Some of them were kind of like obnoxious and not exactly the most likable characters, but I felt like that was done in somewhat of a realistic way considering they've gotten something so absolutely traumatic. And I thought the exploration of the cult was so interesting. Cult novels are always interesting, but man, they really went there in their like backstory and the flashbacks, because most of this takes place in the present day and flashbacks. The present day was giving me nothing, but the flashbacks were intense. I loved the way that tension built and you just like watch things just escalate so far. And then the ending came and I kind of expected to be disappointed, and I will say that I don't think the ending was perfect. I don't think it necessarily killed it, but it was pretty good. I thought that it was going to go in a completely different direction, and they really went there, and I appreciate it. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. If you're at all interested in it, I would absolutely recommend reading it. I think in terms of cult books, it's a pretty good one. Those are all the books I'm going to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back in soon. Bye.